On the summer nights of 1973, three teenage girls headed out separately to enjoy what should have been ordinary weekends in South Wales. They were daughters, friends, and workmates with their whole lives ahead of them, but none of them ever made it home. Their murders left entire communities living in fear, convinced a predator was stalking the streets. Yet despite one of the biggest murder investigations Wales had ever seen, the killer seemed to vanish without a trace. As the years passed, witnesses' memories faded, suspects came and went, and the case drifted further and further from being solved. It looked destined to join the growing list of Britain's most infamous unsolved murders, until, almost 30 years later, a remarkable breakthrough in forensic science gave detectives one final chance to uncover the truth, leading to an investigation that would rewrite the rulebook and make criminal justice history. In this episode of British Murders with Stuart Blues, we're looking at the murders of Sandra Newton, Pauline Floyd, and Geraldine Hughes. It's a case involving one of Britain's earliest serial killers, a decades-long hunt for justice, and the first ever identification of a murder suspect from a DNA sample recovered using a brand new method. Before we begin, please take a moment to follow the show on your podcast player of choice. It's a free and simple way to support the podcast, and it helps it reach a wider audience. Ratings and reviews are always highly appreciated, and for ad-free episodes, early access, and a range of exclusive content, you can support the show at patreon.com/British Murders. By the summer of 1973, South Wales was changing. Coal mining had shaped communities across the region for generations, but many pits were beginning to close, leaving behind a set of abandoned collieries that slowly disappeared back into the landscape. Places like Neath and Port Talbot were still close-knit towns where people knew their neighbours intimately. Teenagers went dancing at the weekends, and parents had no reason to doubt that their children would come home safe. That background and context made what happened in 1973 all the more shocking, and it all began with a 16-year-old girl called Sandra Newton. Sandra lived with her mum, Gwendolyn Williams, and her stepdad at Brynawell in Kimler, just outside Neath. Her parents had divorced some years earlier, and although her dad, Graham Newton, remained part of her life, Sandra ended up living with her mum. Like a lot of teenagers her age, she'd recently started working full-time. She'd been employed for around 5 months at David S. Smith Limited, that's a manufacturing company, where colleagues described her as popular and well-liked. Outside of work, she loved going out with her mates, and a couple of nights out each week were often on the cards for Sandra. She was especially fond of a nightclub, so she was clearly a bit of a social butterfly. On Saturday, July 14th, 1973, 53 years ago almost to the day, she headed out for what should have been another Saturday night. She spent the evening at the Baron nightclub in Britton Ferry, a venue that had only opened its doors 2 nights earlier. It must have been buzzing with people keen to see the new place for themselves and let their hair down. In the early hours of Sunday, July 15th, around 1 a.m., Sandra left the club with a 22-year-old man by her side, who, if I'm not mistaken, was her boyfriend. They walked together for a while before parting ways near the Britton Ferry Working Men's Club. He headed one way, Sandra headed the other, beginning what was roughly a 2 or 3 mile walk back to their respective homes. And the weather that night was miserable. Rain was pouring down, and Sandra was all alone out there in the midsummer darkness. A girl matching her description was later reportedly seen around Stockham's Corner in Neath, and as she disappeared from view, witnesses noticed something else. A light-coloured saloon car drove along the same road towards Neath. According to those who saw it, the brake lights suddenly came on, then went off again, before the car carried on and disappeared into the night. At the time, it probably didn't seem particularly important, but much later, it would become one of the most talked about sightings in the entire investigation. As police appealed for information, 3 further possible sightings of Sandra came in. One witness reported seeing a dark-haired girl aged somewhere between 15 and 18 sitting on a garden wall on Britton Ferry Road at around 3 a.m. That was on July 15th. She was between the Glamorgan Hotel and the Catholic Club. Another person described seeing a young woman with shoulder-length dark hair, wearing a knee-length skirt, platform shoes, and carrying a handbag. She was spotted between 2 and 2:15 that morning at the junction of Britain Ferry Road and Crython Road, walking towards Britain Ferry. A third witness remembered seeing a teenage girl, again, dark shoulder-length hair, wearing a dark coat and a short skirt in Neath Road, somewhere between 2:45 and 2 a.m. Whether any of those sightings really were Sandra has never been proven, but they aren't half similar, suggesting whomever they saw, it was likely the same person. Back at home, Gwendolyn woke that Sunday morning and immediately realised something wasn't right, because Sandra's bed hadn't been slept in. It was still freshly made, and as anyone listening who has a teenager will know, the odds of it being slept in and then remade were beyond unlikely. At first, Gwendolyn probably hoped her daughter had stayed over at a friend's house after the night out, but after ringing round and making a few inquiries, it became clear that wasn't the case. Sandra was nowhere to be found, so Gwendolyn quickly contacted the police and reported her daughter as missing. As the hours turned into days, concern quickly grew, and on Tuesday, July 17th, at around 4:15 p.m, everything changed. A man had been waiting for his nephew near the abandoned Garth Colliery, in a village about a mile outside Neath. With time to spare, he wandered aimlessly off the roadside. Looking down into a dried-up water culvert beneath the road, he noticed what he at first thought was either a shop dummy, aka a mannequin, or a bundle of discarded clothes. As he got closer, he realised with horror that it was the body of a young girl. It was Sandra. The spot where she'd been left was incredibly isolated. Apart from a single occupied house a few hundred yards away, there was virtually nobody around, and the culvert itself couldn't be seen from the road. Police who'd been out searching for Sandra had never even looked there because of that. Had that man not wandered off the road when he did, Sandra's body might have remained hidden for weeks, maybe even months. She was still fully clothed, and a post-mortem carried out by Dr. Owen Glyn Williams found that Sandra had died from compression injuries to her neck. Her own skirt had been wrapped around her neck and tied into a knot beneath her right ear, leaving no doubt that somebody had murdered her. With that, a major investigation was launched almost immediately. Tracker dogs searched the surrounding countryside while mine detectors were brought in, hoping to uncover any weapon or discarded evidence buried beneath the land on which the old colliery stood. Detectives carried out extensive house-to-house inquiries and appealed to anyone who'd been driving through the area during the early hours of Sunday morning to come forward. Police were especially keen to identify the driver of the light-coloured saloon car seen shortly before Sandra vanished. They also wanted to trace a young man who'd reportedly been given a lift close to where Sandra's body was discovered, along with the driver of a yellow Ford Cortina with a black vinyl roof. That car had been parked outside St Clement's Church in Britain Ferry between 1:30 and 2 o'clock that morning. Meanwhile, detectives worked methodically through everyone connected to Sandra. The man she'd left the Baron nightclub with was thoroughly investigated before being completely eliminated from the inquiry. Around 300 vehicles were checked, and everyone who'd been at the Baron nightclub that Saturday night, which was roughly 50 people in total, was interviewed, along with Sandra's family, friends, and work colleagues. The investigation was led by Detective Chief Inspector Idris Jones of Port Talbot, who oversaw a team of around 70 detectives and uniformed officers. Even at this early stage, he feared the worst. He urged young women not to accept lifts from strangers if they found themselves alone late at night, adding that there was a strong possibility that whoever had killed Sandra might kill again. As we'll soon find out, those words couldn't have been more accurate. DCI Jones believed Sandra had most likely accepted a lift while trying to get home after a night out, although he stopped short of describing the killer as what newspapers at the time often called a sex maniac. Detectives also believed whoever dumped Sandra's body knew the area extremely well, because Garth Colliery wasn't exactly somewhere you'd stumble across by accident. It was located on what was often described as a lover's lane, hidden away from passing traffic and familiar only to locals. There was one thing that puzzled investigators, though. Early reports suggested there was no evidence Sandra had been sexually assaulted, and forensic examinations also failed to produce any meaningful leads, leaving detectives with no suspect, no useful description, and very little physical evidence. Across Britain that summer, newspapers were already filled with stories of murdered children. 10-year-old Carl Neve had been strangled in Hull in the East Riding of Yorkshire after disappearing while playing near his home. His body was discovered in a disused workshop about a mile away, and his killer to this day has never been identified. At almost the same time, 11-year-old friends Sandra McCormick and Gail Ganley were murdered in Sunderland, Tyne and Wear. They'd been beaten, sexually assaulted, and strangled. So, with several child murders making national headlines within weeks of one another, some newspapers began wondering whether they could all be somehow linked. There was never any evidence that they were, especially when it came to light later that Anthony Bernard had killed Sandra and Gail, but it gives you an idea of the fear spreading across the country that summer. On Monday, July 23rd, Sandra Newton was laid to rest at a cemetery in Briton Ferry, with more than 100 people gathering in silence as her family and friends stood around her grave during the short burial service. Some detectives also attended. By the beginning of August 1973, officers had interviewed more than 1,000 people. The investigation remained at full strength, and fresh lines of inquiry were still being followed. Vehicles continued to be traced, and witnesses kept coming forward. Yet despite all of that effort, police were no closer to identifying Sandra's killer. In fact, some detectives began convincing themselves that because there appeared to have been such little violence inflicted on Sandra beyond the strangulation itself, the person responsible was probably someone she already knew. They couldn't have been more wrong, as just 2 months after Sandra was murdered, DCI Jones's warning became a horrifying reality. On the night of Saturday, September 15th, 1973, 2 more teenage girls disappeared after a night out, and like Sandra, they were just 16 years old. Their names were Pauline Floyd and Geraldine Hughes. The 2 girls had been best mates for years, and by all accounts were inseparable. Pauline was a redhead who lived in Longford in Neath, and she was the youngest of 5 daughters born to a Mr. and Mrs. Trevor Floyd, as was the reporting style at the time. Geraldine, who had dark brown hair, lived at the Greenway in Clandarcy with her parents. They were Mr. and Mrs. Dennis Hughes. She lived there alongside her younger brother, and although the 2 girls had seemingly drastically different personalities, they complemented each other perfectly. Friends described Geraldine as bubbly, popular, and always up for a laugh. She was the sort of person who could light up a room with just a smile. Pauline was a little quieter and more reserved, but the pair of them were rarely apart. They'd attended the same secondary school, that's where they met, and shared a love of dancing. After leaving school, both of them started working in a sewing factory. Pauline later left to become a shop assistant, but during their time together, they both worked as sewing machine operators at the Lewis Edwards clothing factory in Neath Abbey. They made ladies' clothing for Marks and Spencer. Even though they worked in different sections, they'd always find each other whenever they had a break. Theirs was one of those symbiotic relationships where everyone who knew them never expected to see one without the other. As we approach our main timeline, we arrive at Friday, September 14th, 1973, and that night, Geraldine stayed over at Pauline's house. The following day, she spent some time shopping with her mum before heading back out after tea to meet Pauline once more. That Saturday night followed a familiar routine. The girls travelled into Swansea for a night out at the Top Rank Suite, one of the city's most popular dance venues. They went there regularly and were well used to making the journey. Some reports from the time suggested they'd also gone to see the latest James Bond film, Live and Let Die, starring Roger Moore, which had only arrived in British cinemas a couple of months earlier. Whether they watched the film before or after having a boogie, or whether that detail was simply confused over time, isn't completely clear. But what is certain is that Geraldine caught the 8 p.m. bus from Llandarcy in Swansea at the start of the evening, with Pauline joining her along the route. After a night enjoying themselves, they began making their way home during the early hours of what was by then Sunday, September 16th. At around 1:15 in those very early hours, the girls were seen waiting at a bus stop on Kingsway, close to the Odeon Cinema, and the person who saw them wasn't just any old witness. He was an off-duty police officer who just happened to be Geraldine's cousin. Having also attended Top Rank Suite that night, he stopped for a quick chat and believed they were headed home. The conversation between Geraldine and her cousin would unknowingly be the last confirmed interaction either of the girls would have with anyone other than their killer. Other witnesses later reported seeing the girls hitchhiking near Swansea city centre, which back then, although police constantly warned against it, was still incredibly common. Petrol wasn't cheap. Plenty of young people didn't own cars or couldn't drive. Public transport stopped running long before nights out ended, so many thought nothing of sticking a thumb out and hoping somebody decent stopped to take them home. Sadly, not everyone who stopped had good intentions. Later that Sunday morning, a man was out enjoying a walk near a wooded area in Llandarcy, roughly 7 miles from Swansea, and as he wandered through the copse, he made a shocking discovery. Lying among the trees was the fully clothed body of a young girl, which he initially believed to be a doll of some kind. It was Pauline, and aside from her shoes, which were missing, she was fully clothed. The man's son-in-law dialed 999 immediately upon the witness's return home, and when the police officer who answered that call arrived and began searching the surrounding woodland, he found another body just a short distance away. It was Geraldine. She was lying only around 20 feet from a narrow farm road running alongside playing fields near the BP oil refinery at Llandarcy, and all in, the girls had been left anywhere between 50 and 100 yards apart, depending on which source you believe. For investigators, the similarities with Sandra Newton's murder were impossible to ignore. Home Office pathologist Dr. Owen Glyn Williams, the very same doctor who had examined Sandra's body 2 months earlier, carried out both post-mortems at Singleton Hospital in Swansea. He found that Pauline and Geraldine had both been strangled. But unlike Sandra, whose own skirt had been used against her, these two girls had been killed using lengths of rope which had been cut from a piece of farm machinery before being tied around each girl's neck. This time there was another disturbing discovery. Both girls had been sexually assaulted. Their lower clothing had been removed before being put back on, and semen was recovered during the post-mortem examinations. Geraldine had also suffered a deep wound to the side of her head, while Pauline had bruising to one of her temples. Detectives quickly began piecing together what they believed had happened. Their theory was that the girls had accepted a lift while making their way home, and at some point the driver had turned down a narrow lane beside the woodland. The girls likely realized something was wrong and tried to run away, with police suggesting Pauline was caught first just inside the wood, where she was struck and knocked unconscious. Geraldine was suspected as managing to get further before she too was chased down and attacked. Once both girls had been overpowered, the killer cut rope from a nearby haymaking machine before using it to strangle them where they lay, leaving the ligature wrapped around their necks afterwards. Whether that reconstruction was completely accurate has never been proven, but it fitted the evidence investigators had at the time. Once again, tracker dogs were brought in to search every inch of the woodland. Officers searched for discarded clothing, weapons, and anything else that might point towards the killer, and it was one discovery in particular which gave detectives a glimmer of hope. Near the murder scene, they found tire marks. Investigators believe they could have been left by the killer's vehicle after he'd parked near the entrance to the wood, and witnesses added to that theory when they came forward describing a light-coloured car seen in the area at around 2 a.m. It was believed to be a British Leyland Austin 1100, possibly white or cream in colour. Interestingly, a similar car had also been seen around 6 miles away near the point where Pauline and Geraldine were thought to have accepted a lift in Swansea, so detectives suddenly had something tangible to work with. The hunt for that Austin became enormous, and officers didn't just limit the search to South Wales. The whole of Britain was scoured, and by May 1974, between 9 and 10,000 owners of Austin 1100s in South Wales alone had been traced and interviewed. Another 5,000 people who didn't own that type of car, or didn't own a car at all, had also been questioned. So it was truly one of the biggest inquiries Wales had ever seen. As more evidence was compared, detectives became convinced all three murders, Sandra, Geraldine and Pauline, were connected. Each of them was 16 years old. They were all killed within the space of just 2 months after last being seen on a Saturday night out. All of them were murdered during a period of heavy rain, with their bodies left in isolated locations. And years later, another heartbreaking detail emerged. According to one source, in May 1990, it was revealed that the three girls had actually briefly known each other. Sandra had supposedly met Pauline and Geraldine while attending a sewing course in Port Talbot before they all started work, which, if true, is one of those tragic twists that really stays with you. Despite the scale of the investigation, the case gradually began to go cold. Thousands of interviews, checked vehicles, and leads came in, yet the person responsible had somehow slipped through the net. That didn't mean the investigation stopped, though. Far from it. Every so often, detectives received fresh information that gave them hope, only for it to lead absolutely nowhere, with one such frustrating moment coming in October 1974. A man walked into a police station in Reading, Berkshire, falsely claiming he'd murdered Sandra Newton, which is the sort of thing that happens perhaps more often than you'd think in major murder inquiries. Some people just crave attention, and others have serious mental health conditions. Even so, every confession has to be taken seriously until it's proven otherwise. So the man was taken to South Wales and interviewed over 2 days at Sandfields police station in Port Talbot. Detectives questioned him extensively, checking every detail of his story against the evidence they held. And before long, it became obvious he couldn't possibly have committed the murder. He'd made the whole thing up and was sent on his way back home to Reading. But that wasn't quite the end of the matter. In March 1975, he appeared in court, where he admitted making false reports to the police. Psychiatric reports were ordered, and it emerged that, although he was 20 years old, his mental age was believed to be somewhere between 9 and 10. 2 months later, magistrates ordered that he be returned to Borstal. For Sandra's family, it must have been another cruel twist in what was already a heavily emotional rollercoaster. For a brief moment, they'd been led to believe there might finally be answers, but in the space of a couple of days, they were back to square one. In early 1976, South Wales was rocked by yet another murder. On Sunday, February 22nd, the body of 26-year-old Maureen Mulcahy was discovered on waste ground behind Pendarvis Terrace in Aberavon, around a mile from her home in Burns Road, Sandfields. Maureen was a mother of 2, who, like Sandra, Pauline and Geraldine before her, had been out on a Saturday night before she were killed. Investigators said there was no evidence she'd been sexually assaulted, but there were clear signs that the attack had been sexually motivated. She'd done her best to fight back, with evidence suggesting there'd been a struggle, and she'd been struck at least once in the face, either with a fist or some sort of object. Almost immediately, people began asking the obvious question: was this the same killer striking again? Even detectives admitted they couldn't rule it out. Officially, Maureen's murder has never been solved, but to this day it's regularly discussed alongside the murders of Sandra, Pauline and Geraldine. Whether all 4 victims were murdered by the same man has never been conclusively proven, but it's certainly a theory that's refused to disappear over the years. As the decades continued to pass, the investigation entered a new era. The witnesses' memories faded. Some people moved away. Others died, and evidence that would have been considered cutting-edge in 1973 became outdated almost overnight as forensic science continued advancing at an incredible pace. Then, almost 30 years after the murders, a huge announcement was made. In November 2000, South Wales police revealed that forensic scientists had successfully extracted a usable DNA profile from samples recovered during the original investigation. That alone was a remarkable achievement, as the evidence had been sitting in storage for decades. And back in the early 70s, DNA profiling didn't even exist. It would have been unfathomable for those who participated in the initial investigation to imagine that tiny traces left behind by the killer would one day become the key to identifying him. Less than a year later, in October 2001, detectives officially confirmed something they'd long suspected. Sandra, Pauline, and Geraldine had all been murdered by the same person. The DNA proved it beyond doubt, and South Wales now knew they'd been hunting a serial killer all along. And if that wasn't unsettling enough, there was every chance he was still alive. Detectives also believed the same offender may well have been responsible for Maureen Mulcahy's murder, but there was no conclusive proof to tie him to the killing. There was also another huge problem. When they searched the National DNA database, which had only been introduced in 1995, there wasn't a single match. It would have been easy to give up and think that was the end of the road, but instead, one forensic scientist came up with an idea that had never been tried. His name was Jonathan Whittaker, and he knew that every child inherits roughly half of their DNA from each parent. So rather than searching for the killer directly, he wondered whether they could search for one of the killer's children. It was a bold idea, revolutionary at the time, as nobody had ever identified a murder suspect by looking for a relative on the DNA database. It was completely uncharted territory, and as you'd expect, the first search didn't identify the killer. What it did produce, however, was a list of just over 100 men who appeared to be biologically related to whoever had left the DNA behind all those years ago. That list had been narrowed down from around 22,000 possible names. Now detectives had something they could actually work with. They combined those results with everything gathered during nearly 3 decades of investigation. Witness statements, old intelligence, known criminals, people who lived locally. Gradually, one family started standing out from the rest, and a man named Paul Capon attracted investigators' attention. At first glance, he seemed promising, except for one very obvious problem. Paul had only been 7 years old when Sandra, Pauline, and Geraldine were murdered, so there was no way he could have been responsible. But, as we've covered, detectives weren't interested in Paul. They believed he might be related to the killer, and after persuading other members of the Capon family to voluntarily provide DNA samples, forensic scientists made a breakthrough. The family DNA matched the profile recovered from the crime scenes, meaning detectives finally knew whose bloodline they were looking at. All the evidence pointed towards one man, Joseph William Capon, known better to most people simply as Joe. He'd been in his early 30s when Sandra, Pauline, and Geraldine were murdered, meaning he'd now be approaching 60. But there was to be one final twist. The man detectives believed they'd spent almost 30 years hunting was no longer alive. But who exactly was Joseph William Capon? The answer is deeply unsettling. Capon was born in 1941 and grew up in Port Talbot as one of 7 children. His parents' marriage eventually broke down, meaning he was largely raised by his stepfather, and it didn't take long before he came onto the police's radar. By the tender age of 12, he'd already begun accumulating a criminal record. Over the years that followed, he racked up more than 30 convictions for offences, including stealing from gas meters, car theft, burglary, and assault. So prison became a recurring feature of his life. It seems like he was more often a prisoner than he was a free man. When he wasn't behind bars, he drifted between jobs. He worked as a lorry driver, a bus driver, and occasionally as a nightclub doorman, but he never seemed able to hold down steady employment for long. According to people who knew him, he preferred what was known locally as hobbling, which meant he signed on for benefits while earning cash in hand on the side through odd jobs and unofficial work. He smoked weed occasionally and may have done a bit of dealing, but his real addiction was tobacco. He chewed it, smoked around 20 old Hoban roll-ups a day, and the stench of cigarettes apparently clung to him like, well, a bad smell. What strikes me most when you read accounts of Kappen is how many people said the same thing. Everyone knew of him, but nobody really knew him. He was a loner who nevertheless seemed to be everywhere. He'd visit 2 or 3 pubs a night, play on local darts teams, chat to people. Yet he rarely drank more than a pint or two, always remaining in control of his inhibitions. In 1962, he met a 17-year-old girl called Christine Powell on Port Talbot beachfront. Christine later remembered that nobody had any money in those days. Young people would sit in cafes nursing a 6-pence coffee for hours. It was cold, and the first thing Kappen did was buy her a hot chocolate to warm her hands. She said it was the first genuinely kind thing anyone had ever done for her. At the time, Kappen appeared to be quite a catch. He was 6'1", physically imposing, dark-haired with striking slate blue eyes. And unusually for a young man from a poor background, he owned cars and was obsessed with fixing them up. Christine was young and inexperienced, so fell for him quickly. Their relationship moved fast. She became pregnant in 1963 and they married the following February. There was to be no honeymoon though, because just 10 days after the wedding, Kappen was sent to prison for 3 years for breaking into houses and stealing from gas meters. Their first child was born while he was incarcerated, and a story from that period is particularly disturbing. In August 1965, Kappen was granted day parole to attend his granddad's funeral. During the wake, with the prison warder downstairs, he dragged Christine into an upstairs bedroom and forced himself on her. By the time he was eventually released from the latest stint behind bars, he was the father of 2 children he'd barely met. The family settled on the Sandfields estate in Port Talbot, but Christine later described the marriage as a life lived in fear. Money was constantly short because Kappen was repeatedly in trouble with the law. He'd steal scrap lead, lose jobs, take money from her purse, and contribute little to the household. More chilling were her descriptions of the violence he inflicted on her. She said he regularly beat her up and raped her, insisting on what he called his conjugal rights. Now, in the 1970s, domestic abuse was rarely treated with the seriousness it deserved, and Christine never felt able to press charges. Also, rape in marriage was not considered a crime in the UK at the time. A husband could not be prosecuted for raping his wife due to the presumption of irrevocable consent, which is what Kappen was alluding to. In the eyes of the law, he did not have to seek Caroline's consent before engaging in sexual activity with her. Shocking, I know. Kappen's hobbies, like his social life, were solitary ones. Breeding canaries, keeping tropical fish, and racing greyhounds. One incident involving a greyhound has actually haunted many people who later learned about it. When he decided the dog was too old, he allegedly strangled it with a wire on the beach in front of his terrified young son, the aforementioned Paul Kappen. Another time, after his children had eaten some fig roll biscuits, he forced them to wander the streets in pouring rain at 11 o'clock at night, trying to replace them. Former detectives later said he ruled his family through intimidation and terror. And here's the part that still makes experienced investigators shake their heads. Kappen was not some unknown stranger who emerged decades later. He had actually featured in the original murder inquiry. After Pauline and Geraldine were killed, detectives visited him on October 13, 1973, less than a month after the murders. At the time, he was living in Sandfields, the same area where Maureen Mulcahy would later live before her own unsolved murder. When officers arrived at Kappen's home, they found his Austin 1100 sitting on blocks with the wheels removed. Detectives believed he may have been trying to change the tyres after newspapers reported that police had recovered a cast of the killer's tyre marks from the Llandarcy scene. Kappen told officers he'd put the car on blocks the day after the murders, and it sounded plausible, but buried elsewhere in police records was a crucial contradiction. During routine stop-and-check operations in the week after the killings, both Capon and his Austin had been logged as being on the road. In other words, his story couldn't be true. Now today, a computer would flag that discrepancy instantly, but in 1973, with paper records stored in different locations and no digital cross-referencing, nobody made the connection, so his lie went unnoticed. In his formal statement, Capon claimed he'd returned from Neath Fair around 9:30 p.m. on the Saturday Geraldine and Pauline had gone out, and spent the evening looking for his canaries until about 10:45 p.m. He then claimed to have gone to bed with Christine and not got up until 10:30 the next morning. Christine sat beside him and confirmed the alibi, despite it being a lie. Years later, she explained that she'd always done that whenever the police came knocking. It was an autonomous response by that point. On such and such a night, he was with me, officer, she said, while later stating that she simply couldn't imagine Capon killing children and had never noticed him having an unusual interest in young girls. But other people painted a very different picture. Capon regularly pursued teenage girls, even into his 40s. Working as a doorman brought him into contact with younger women all the time, and friends later said he seemed to enjoy parading much younger girlfriends around town. Former detectives became convinced he was a sexual predator who operated with extraordinary confidence. When he worked on local buses, he would spend breaks on the village green at Llandarcy, the very area where Pauline and Geraldine were murdered, chatting up young girls. They believed he carried weapons and may have even arrived at Llandarcy already prepared with a ligature. That confidence, they argued, explained why he was willing to offend in his own backyard despite the obvious risk of being recognised. And by the time detectives identified him through the DNA investigation, Capon had been dead for more than a decade. He died of lung cancer in June 1990 at the age of 49. If we rewind just a touch, Capon had lived with a local barmaid named Sandra on the Baglan estate after leaving Christine, though in his final years, his illness had reduced him dramatically. The once imposing man became increasingly housebound and eventually relied on a wheelchair. An obituary published in the South Wales Daily Post described him as a much-loved partner, son, father, grandpa and brother. It's a stark reminder that serial killers are often mourned by people who never know the truth about them. In December 2001, detectives announced they intended to exhume Capon's body to obtain DNA samples. And this is where the case made legal and forensic history. Had Capon been cremated, these murders might still officially be unsolved today. But because he was buried, it allowed the case to eventually be solved. Permission was finally granted, and the exhumation began shortly after midnight on May 17, 2002. 15 hours later, after removing 2 coffins from a family plot, officers and undertakers carried Capon's remains through the rain to a waiting hearse bound for Swansea. Scientists opened the coffin and removed teeth and a femur, the parts of the body most likely to preserve DNA after many years underground. Once the samples were taken, Capon and his relatives were reburied. Then came the announcement that finally closed the case. On June 6, 2002, South Wales Police confirmed that DNA from Capon's exhumed remains conclusively matched the crime scene DNA recovered from Sandra, Pauline and Geraldine. For the first time in history, a murder suspect had been identified using a posthumous DNA sample obtained from an exhumed body and linked through familial searching of the DNA database. It was a forensic landmark. But because Capon was dead, he could never be arrested, interviewed under caution, or tried in a court of law for the 3 murders. So the police were careful with their wording. They said that, had he been alive, he would likely have been charged with the murders, but they would technically never be able to say definitively that he was the girl's killer. The revelation also reopened some other mysteries. Just 5 days later, Humberside police announced they were reviewing the disappearance of Christine Markham from Scunthorpe, who vanished on May 21st, 1973, the day after her 9th birthday. Capon had been living in lodgings in the area around that time and working as a contracted lorry driver. Christine has never been found to this day, and investigators have long considered both Capon and the child serial killer Robert Black as possible suspects. The overlap between those two men is disturbing, to say the least. After Capon was publicly identified, more women came forward with allegations stretching back to the early 60s. One woman described being attacked by him at the age of 15 in a half-built house on the Sandfields estate before somehow managing to escape. Perhaps the most chilling account involved two female hitchhikers in February 1973, just months before Sandra Newton was murdered. A man in a, you guessed it, Austin 1100, picked them up near Neath, drove past their destination onto an isolated road, locked the doors, and told them, "I know you want it." He grabbed one girl and began sexually assaulting her while punching the other when she tried to intervene. The girls only escaped because one managed to claw up the door lock with her fingernails and nearby residents switched on their lights. Terrified of getting into trouble with her strict father, one of the girls never reported the attack to the police. Investigators later became convinced that attacker was almost certainly Capon. For nearly 3 decades, the families of Sandra, Pauline, and Geraldine lived without answers, while the man who almost certainly killed them carried on living in the same community, drinking in the same pubs, and even speaking to the police during the original investigation. In the end, it wasn't a witness that exposed him. It wasn't a confession, it wasn't a forgotten fingerprint. It was a few surviving fragments of DNA. A scientist willing to try something nobody had attempted before, and the extraordinary decision to exhume a man who'd been buried for 12 years. Sandra Newton, Pauline Floyd, and Geraldine Hughes were all just 16 years old when their lives were taken in the summer and autumn of 1973. Their killer was never brought before a jury, but thanks to one of the most significant breakthroughs in forensic history, their names are no longer attached to an unsolved mystery. And for their families, after almost 30 years of uncertainty, that at least brought a measure of the truth. Thanks so much for listening to British Murders with Stuart Blues. To access ad-free episodes, early releases, and exclusive content, visit patreon.com/British Murders. You must join my Armchair Detectives or Inner Circle tiers to gain those benefits. You can also support the show by following British Murders on your podcast player of choice. It's as simple as that. It helps more than you might realise. And as always, ratings and reviews are greatly appreciated. That's it for now. Until next time, cheerio.